There we go. So my background is originally a little different than a lot of Elm developers. The thing I'm probably best known for in the Elm community is that I produce and direct the Elm Europe live stream. Because, thank you. Because until literally earlier this month, I ran a small boutique video production company that did commercials and live streams. Before that, I worked in film and TV in Los Angeles and New York. And I didn't start out in production. I started out as a writer. In fact, I have a BFA in screenwriting. So if you think your philosophy major was made it hard to get a job, So today I'm going to show you a prototype of something I've been working on. Let me say that it's a very early prototype. It's not nearly as polished as Andrew's game, which is amazing. But I do think that as somebody who used to be a working screenwriter and who now is a working Elm developer, I'm pretty uniquely qualified to talk about and to write a WYSIWYG screenwriting app using Elm-UI and Elm parser. So first of all, I want to talk about what screenplays are and aren't for a second. A screenplay is not a novel. In a screenplay, we only record things that we can see and hear on screen. We don't hear characters' internal thoughts unless it's voiceover. We don't hear about the history of the world of the movie unless it's a character describing it through dialogue. And we don't hear philosophical observations about life or about history the way we might in a novel, unless, of course, it's a really pretentious student film. Instead, all we record in a screenplay are things that we can see and hear, which fall into a handful of categories. One is dialogue, which starts with a character name and is followed by a line for the actor to say, or possibly a nonverbal direction for an actor. This is how the Simpsons writers describe dough. A special case is a slug line, which is a scene heading, which tells us whether it's an interior or exterior shot, where it's set, and usually whether it's day or night. Not this one. This is really from the Star Wars screenplay. We also have transitions sometimes, like a dissolve to or a star wipe to. And we might have a piece of action or a description. You can also have things like lyrics, a couple other special cases, but these are the main ones. And from these basic elements, we can tell an entire story. And this is really important because everyone on the film, everyone who works on the film, whether it's the people putting together the budget, the schedule, making the costumes, the actors learning the lines, the director and the cinematographer figuring out the shots and the lighting, they're all working off of this document, the screenplay. And so it really has to be formatted in a standard way. And the formatting of it is really important because from glancing at a script, an experienced line producer, for instance, can figure out the budget or the schedule for the film. And they can time how long the movie's going to be, sometimes down to the minute. So you can't fudge the formatting, which is why we use editors to write screenplays rather than just doing it in Microsoft Word. So I didn't make my own screenplay markup format. There's already one called Fountain that a lot of people worked really hard on, and I think it's the best way to write a screenplay. But I did write my own editor for writing Fountain documents and seeing the progress as you go. And I'm going to demo that very briefly. If I can get out of this library thing. So here's our editor. I can do, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, this is going to make it harder. So I can write a slug line, say it's an interior Newberry Library day. That you see it just made it an uppercase, which is how that's properly formatted. A group of interested Elm developers watch a handsome young man demo his app. Hello, Chicago. And then, of course, a star wipe too. Except, actually, that did the correct thing because this has to be separated by a separate line. And if it is, and we get rid of this, there, now it's a transition to the next scene. Thank you, because this was really hard. So let's go back to these slides for a minute. So a WYSIWYG editor lets you edit text and display it in something close to its final form. Usually it's actual final form, but in my case, I'm not quite there yet, so I'm like really close. In order to do that, there's 3 things it has to do. It has to parse, if you're using a markup language like I am, it has to parse that. It has to be able to manipulate the text data and the data within it, and it has to be able to render it. So I'm going to start by talking about the parsing. So my original plan was to treat the screenplay like a programming language, because in fact the screenplay is a lot like code. People follow it. It's a list of instructions of what you're going to put on screen, and people interpret it. It's human readable, but it's a lot like a programming language. And I thought that I could infer types in the screenplay and enforce rules around them, which is what Elm does. And Elm has an excellent parser that's really great at doing that. And so I tried to write a typed parser. And I thought it would be really awesome, because I could check if I did things right. Like, you'll notice that after I wrote that slug line, I capitalized the group of people and also my name. And that's there because somebody has to go through and say, okay, we're doing the schedule. Okay, here's the scene. Who's in the scene? What special people or equipment do I need for the scene? Okay, this is capitalized. There, I know easily. And now I haven't forgotten that we need Jack Nicholson that day. And we start to shoot and we realize he's in the scene and we didn't pay attention to him. So I thought I could enforce those rules and give error messages if you don't have them. But the real world intervened, and it turns out people don't really write strictly formatted screenplays. One of the creators of this fountain markup format is a famous screenwriter named John August, and he's released a number of his screenplays in the format, including Big Fish. And I kept running Big Fish through my parser. It's still what I used to test it. And very quickly, everything fell apart, because oftentimes scripts do ignore like textbook requirements about the shape of a scene or transitions between the scenes. Scenes move into each other fluidly, more fluidly than my parser expected. And I take some water. So I had to add more and more types, like non-scenic scene. I don't know what that means either. And I think the problem was that I was thinking about the basic unit of the document as a scene. And I don't think that's correct. I actually think the basic unit of a screenplay is a block. And what I mean by a block is usually it's a single line of text, exterior Titanic deck day, a slug line, but it could also be like a character name with a piece of dialogue. It's a separated by an empty line block of text. And actually it can be even more complicated than that. And by the way, interestingly, as I was running this through my new block by block parser, I came up with a lot of examples that were parsed right. So this is what a lot of my tests look like. I don't know if you can read this, it's pretty dark text, but it's basically, there's like dozens of examples of like, here is a block of text that it didn't parse right, and so I've written a lot of tests around that. I find that kind of interesting. I've never had anything like that before. So when you're writing an editor though, a block by block parser, which works pretty well, it's not always enough. And here's why it's not always enough. Because like, here's a line I could be editing, right? I've already established my character name. I have some nonverbal dialogue afterwards, and in the middle I have another line. But the cursor's on that line, and that line can change. And the minute it changes, the whole context of the block can change. So for instance, if I had my cursor right there and I hit enter, I now have this. And this is correct now. Homer's no longer a character name. It's a piece of description or action. And these are also description and action. They may not make contextual sense to us as humans, but this is correct. This is correctly parsing the format. So what I'm doing now, when I'm actually having my editor open, as opposed to when I'm then formatting it for a PDF, is parsing line by line. I just parsed one line of text at a time. And that's also a little bit more performant. So I had to write a second, really a third parser that was a little bit looser that went by line, but context still matters, right? I left my keys in is a dialogue block because it comes after a character name. And so I actually have to give myself context. And I also actually need to know what the next line is. So I have a parser that looks something like this. It takes a context and, in this case, a Boolean to see if it's an empty line next, and that gets me my result. So I was concerned at first that Elm parser wouldn't be as fast as a set of regular expressions. After all, Elm parser at least used to have a little bit of a reputation of being kind of slow. Used to, it's only like a year old, but like, that wasn't a shot at Evan, but and the documents I'm going to parse though are hundreds of pages. They can be, some of them are tens of thousands of lines of text. But Elm parser, when I'm compiling in optimized mode at least, is really fast. The line-by-line parser can parse 125 screenplay in about 1 to 2 seconds on an iPhone. And the block-by-block parser handles it in about 2 to 3, so almost the same. It's really fast. It's fast enough. Don't worry about using it, is what I would say. That said, it's still not fast enough, because when I make this edit, I don't want to reparse the whole document, all 100 pages. I only want to parse those lines I have to. Because if you had to wait 2 to 3 seconds for it to parse the whole document, every time you typed a letter, the context could change. You'd be waiting forever. So right now, every time I make a change, I parse forward about a page of text, and I parse backwards about a page of text. And that's enough, and it can do that in less than 1 animation frame, which is really great. And I mean, you guys saw earlier. I'm going to try to avoid going back and forth to this demo because it's a little bit hard, but you know, like, actually, it should be on a line, I'm sorry. Like, the whole thing it's pretty responsive, right? I don't know how to spell yippee-ki-yay. It's pretty responsive. There's no lag. It's fine to work in. I wrote a short film on the plane. I'm not going to show it to you because I wrote it on an hour flight. Sorry. So I actually have another parser in here because once you have a line of dialogue or a line of anything, it can also be bolded or italicized or underlined. And it uses similar to Markdown formatting of asterisks and underscores. So once I've parsed what the element is it a piece of dialogue? Is it a character name? I then also go through, as I'm rendering it, to see, does it have any extra formatting on it? Okay, manipulating the data. This is my favorite part. I guess because I'm kind of manipulative. So there's a lot of really gnarly state management involved in any text editor. And I really wanted to avoid writing those things myself, right? I really didn't want to have to figure out the number of rows for a given piece of text, or track the cursor. Or, because to do either of those, I would have had to write my own word wrap. And I really didn't want to do that. Those are hard things. They're painful. But I wanted to take advantage of the complex text formatting afforded by the DOM. So my initial plan was to use content editable attributes on the blocks of text I was currently editing. And content editable provides some pretty decent text editing tools. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. Except that it turns out that content editable doesn't play all that nicely with virtual DOM. Adding content editable attribute to an Elm-UI paragraph actually caused all kinds of runtime errors for me. I would actually recommend staying away from content editable for now. It was tough. So I was using Elm-UI. I thought I could use input.multiline. I had a prototype that did this. If you're not familiar with Elm-UI, you should be because it's awesome. But this is just a text area. It's a fancy wrapper on HTML text area. You lose some of the complex formatting that way, but you get even better cursor management. Here's how it worked. You would have a couple lines of text. This element on top would be a paragraph, the one on bottom would be a regular paragraph, and then the one in the middle would be a multi-line, because that's the one you're editing. But cursor management was a real problem. I had to write more and more functionality to manage the cursor, particularly when moving from block to block. It would refocus, it would move the cursor to the end, I would have to reset it. That would actually, they might be a frame or two apart. If you were typing too fast, you could actually get characters in the wrong place. And in order to make it work, I started to have to manually calculate the number of rows. And I had to track the cursor. And in order to do that, I had to write my own word wrap. Yep, that happened. while I was on my bachelor party week. And all of that was really, really hard. But the only reason I really could get it done in a reasonable amount of time is that Screenplays always use a monospaced font, and they always use the same font size. This was my savior. If you don't know what a monospaced font is, it means that every character is the same width, and because it's the same font size, every character is the same height. If you were using Helvetica or something that isn't monospaced, you would have to know the size of every character in order to calculate where the cursor is. You would go insane. We would have to hospitalize you because it would just be, you would be dehydrated, it would be terrible. So if you're going to build an editor that uses a non-monospaced font, good luck. It's going to be a lot harder. And especially because I can rely on the same font size every time. This made it a lot easier. But I'm not the only one lucky enough only to have monospaced fonts because we all use code editors every day, and they use usually a single-size monospaced font. So if you're writing a code editor, you can do the same thing I did here. And it won't be nearly as hard as if you're writing a blog editor where you need to use non-monospaced fonts. Okay, so storing the data I want to manipulate, now that I know where my cursor is, I know where my pieces of text are being inserted, I need to figure out how I want to store it in memory. And line breaks are really important in this screenplay. So I didn't just want to start with like a huge string. I can pretty safely break them into lines and parse that way. So that's the first thing I do. I break into a list of individual lines using the core library string.lines function. And I get something like this. I get a list of strings in order, all the lines in my screenplay. Now, the naive approach might be to keep track of the line that we're currently editing by just keeping an index, an integer, or on line 13. Maybe this would be better to do with an array, right? Because it's easier to, arrays have an index. We don't have to manually go through and find that index. And this would work fine if you were editing 100 lines of text. But screenplays are tens of thousands of lines of text sometimes. So what do we know about linked lists? We know that manipulating nodes towards the end of a linked list is really expensive. It takes a long time. And to modify a node in an array, you can randomly modify a single row. But if you want to add a row at the end, that's expensive. And if you want to, God forbid, add a row in the middle, that's really expensive. So instead, what I'm using is a zipper. Who here knows what a zipper is? Okay, cool. I'm really glad. So some people do, some people don't. It's a really great data structure, and you should use it. By the way, just really fast, I'm going to save you some Googling. If you're ever making a text editor, you're going to hear a lot about ropes and gap buffers. That's not really separate from what I'm talking about. A gap buffer is a form of a zipper. So yeah, so I just saved you 2 days of Googling, figuring out that nomenclature. You're welcome. So the way that a zipper works is that we separate our lines before our currently selected line and our lines after, and then we also keep our current line, right? So the reason for this is that all of the editing that we're going to do is almost certainly going to be either on the current line, or it's going to involve the line before it or the line after it, at least a few lines with it. You're probably not jumping randomly around the screenplay 15 pages apart that often. And so we store it like this, right? We have our before lines, we have our current line, and we have our after lines. Pretty simple. And this works really great for the current line. It's now just a string, easy to manipulate, very fast. And it actually works really well for the lines after, right? Because if we're modifying the line right after, it's right at the head of a list, and that's easy, that's cheap. But what if we want to modify the line that's before the current line? We still have to traverse the entire list to get there. Expensive. So there's an easy way to fix this, which is to take our before list and to reverse it. Store it as a reversed list. Don't forget that you're storing it as a reversed list. You'll get your screenplayably backwards. And now it looks like this, right? The head of both of our lists are the lines immediately adjacent to the one we're selected, and so on and so forth. And the more computationally expensive ones are going to be further away, and you're going to be touching them less often. And 99% of our editing, by the way, is going to be in that area. Very little of it's going to be more than 2 lines away. By the way, this is called a zipper list. You can also make a zipper array. You can make a zipper tree. Pretty much any recursive data structure can be made into a zipper. That's why they're so cool. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about performance of the parser and performance of the data structures, but those really haven't been the major bottleneck for me. When I went from parsing a few pages of a screenplay, 4 or 5 pages, to an entire 120-page screenplay, the browser would lock up. And for a long time, I thought it was the parser. I thought the parser was just not handling it fast enough. And I kept benchmarking it. I kept optimizing it. It seemed like it should work. It worked in the REPL. But after working on it, I'm pretty sure it was the DOM. Google recommends in Chrome that you not have more than 1,500 DOM nodes. If you're rendering 4,700 lines of a short screenplay, each is a different DOM node. In fact, each is 2 DOM nodes. That really adds up. So my current plan, and I haven't implemented it yet, is to keep track of the viewport and only render those DOM nodes that are visible or very near to that. And I'm probably going to use another zipper to do it, of parsed elements. It's a lot harder. Again, I'm keeping track of my own line heights. So if a line is not actually a line, but actually word wraps, and it's actually 6 lines because it's a long sentence, I'm going to have to take account of that when I do this. But that's my current plan. I have kind of a working version of it, which is that it's manual. If I come in here, if I can find my cursor, and I open a longer screenplay, this is the movie Big Fish, all the way to the end. Right now, of course, all you can see is about 2 pages worth. But as I click through, pretty instantaneously, it updates. Now, I'm not tracking the viewport yet for this, but that will work. By the way, there's one other element that I forgot to talk about, and it's one of my favorites just because it's visually so different, which is that you can manually insert a page break. This Newport library keeps asking me to accept the terms of service, and I refuse. It's asking me again. It's not going to get it. Okay, so I want to touch briefly on using Elm parser for this project instead of regular expressions. Part of the reason I chose Elm parser was that my original plan was to provide excellent Elm-like error messages for screenplay authors. But as I discovered, human beings don't really write that way. And so using Elm parser compared to regular expressions was kind of a wash in a way, in particular because there are existing open source regular expressions for parsing this format. And instead I spent 2 months writing various parsers. But I learned a lot and made friends along the way. But there are still some benefits to using Elm parser. As I noted, the speed of the parser isn't a hindrance, and I get type safety with it. Like one of the ways one of the handful of ways you can get runtime errors in Elm is with incorrect regular expressions. I don't believe that's been fixed yet, or ever will be, I don't know. So I'm not gonna happen because I'm using parser. And I think in the long term it's gonna be much easier to maintain and add on to, and I've still got some things to add. The other thing that I used is Elm-UI, and that's the title, so I feel like I have to talk about it. Also, I love Elm-UI, I'm like its biggest cheerleader. A lot of what I was doing was really low-level text formatting, and Elm-UI, it wasn't that helpful there, just because A, it doesn't have those tools, and B, I needed to use a lot of like HTML attributes anyway. But where it really made my life super easy was adding things like that page break, or the gray spacing on the other sides, or the menu, the open and save menu, which is really simple, but I think that took me like 10 seconds to add in Elm-UI. Like, it's so simple, like just use it. And the other one is the cursor. Did you see the cursor? Like, you see that big, you see the big red blinking cursor? Like, that's just an in-front Elm-UI element, if you know what that is. And I used move up and move down to move it along where the selection is. And, you know, that wouldn't have been that easy with, like, pixel tracking in CSS. So, thank you, Matt. You made my life a lot easier again. So, going forward, there's a couple things I'd like to add. Copy paste. This is not as easy as it should be because I have to track all the lines, and if I'm across multiple elements, that's actually going to be a huge pain. But that's the choice I made when I agreed to make this thing with myself. Undo, redo, which the Elm architecture should actually make very simple. assuming I don't run out of memory and have to optimize it somehow. I have manual page breaks. I'd like to have automatic page breaks. That's a really important thing in this sort of thing. Again, that's really about implementing the line tracking. If I can do that, if I can count the lines, I can do that. I'd like to go back to adding really great error messages. I think I can still do this, but I think what I have to do is look at the parsed file and then do another step. But I think I can do it after, sort of the way that like error messages come up in your favorite code editor when you're writing Elm, where they come up a second or two after you make the change. I think I can still do that, and I think that would be really awesome. I'd like to do a Vim-like keyboard interface, just because I think those are awesome for power users, yeah. And finally, I really want to add versioning control using GitHub. And GitHub has a really nice GraphQL API, and we, in the Elm world, are lucky enough to have a best-in-class GraphQL client library that Dylan wrote, which I'm like really excited to use. So thank you. That's me. That's how you reach me on Twitter. Feel free to send me emails with questions. Any questions? We've got about 2 minutes. Okay. Well, with somebody.
I wanted to ask: is there how difficult is to get screenplays for famous movies? Is that like something hidden or something that's like GitHub and you just go and find it?
You mean like in the fountain format?
Yeah.
So a handful of people have released screenplays in the fountain format and made them publicly available to download. Again, John August created the format, so he made the thing available. Probably there's not that many others released. A lot of the screenplays you read online are actually just transcriptions that people have done themselves. Yeah. Yes?
Would you say more words about a block? Like how you're framing a block in your program?
Yeah, so a block is really, it's actually pretty simple. It's just something that has 2 escaped line return characters beforehand, right? So it's something that has an empty line of text before and an empty line of text after. Or the beginning of the document, and then a piece of something, and then an empty line of text. This format probably makes it easier. In other formats, that's probably not the case. You know, you typically don't add a manual line in between paragraphs, for instance, in Word. That's just a nice thing about this format. All right, I'm out of time. Thank you so much, everyone.